Definitely by 2020, NASCAR kind of reached a low point. I mean, it's been bleeding viewership. It's been shutting down tracks. They've been stripping out grandstands at Daytona. The sport is certainly losing its popularity. I mean, you have to bear in mind that the turn of the millennium, NASCAR was huge. It surpassed the MLB in viewership in many regions.
Really?
It was poised to surpass the NBA, NHL, even the NFL in some markets. It was huge. Signed huge TV deals. And in some respects, you could just say that NASCAR executives, it was all in one family, that they got greedy. That's certainly true. But you're right that it was kind of this sort of quest to continue to grow the sport that meant that it lost its regional and cultural distinctives and that it lost its base. Especially when it began to try to tinker with the sport and the things that made it a very unique product to watch.
Mm-hmm. Like what?
So for one, in the wake of Dale's death, they launched this massive R&D facility in Concord, North Carolina, where I'm from, where they developed the car of tomorrow, which was, super safe, but also super boxy, and it drive terribly. Drivers complained about it all the time. They were slapped with fines for complaining about it in public. The first driver to win a race in a car of tomorrow complained about it in Victory Lane. I mean, this is not a popular thing. They also changed the competition to it. NASCAR had always been regulated by a point system. So, it wasn't just sort of the number of races you won, but also the number of laps led, poles held, that sort of thing. Your finishing position mattered too, of course. But there was always a fairly sophisticated algorithm, more or less, that determined who was the winner. NASCAR began to tinker with this, in part because they got competitive and greedy, particularly with the NFL and MLB. Mm-hmm. There's no postseason in NASCAR. There's no playoff, or at least there shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. And so they decided that there should be. Mm-hmm. So they created essentially a faux playoff where sort of the last 10 races of the year, this is beginning like 2004, they created the chase, where they sort of took I think it was the top 16 finishers, and they essentially hit reset and started the season all over again. And they introduced elimination rounds and this kind of thing. It became incredibly confusing. So confusing, in fact, they had to publish an FAQ on the rules. It was incredibly complicated. And, fans complained. They poll tested the idea of a chase. It got completely shut down by the fans. The fans rejected it, and NASCAR essentially rejected the polls and announced the launch of the chase the following day. But it really did sort of change the spirit and ethos of the sport in meaningful ways. And it's unsurprising that it's continued to bleed viewers ever since. I grew up in the North Carolina Piedmont, so grew up going to races and grew up in a town next over from Dale Earnhardt's hometown, the great hero of American auto racing, especially in the 80s and 90s. Dale Earnhardt died in 2001 at the Daytona 500. And his death, as I've written about before, really kicked off a series of changes to that sport that coincided with NAFTA and the entry of China into the WTO, this sort of wave of liberalizing reforms in the 90s and early 2000s that was decimating the South, in particular the New South, the industrialized South of, mostly, black and white working class manufacturing laborers that were also the backbone of NASCAR's fan base. And these changes were from everywhere, from regulating safety. Of course, Dale had died and they didn't want to have another high profile racer die. So they regulated safety, they regulated competition, they brought in some kind of sort of proto woke cultural changes. But maybe the most interesting one, I think, was they kind of did offshoring in NASCAR. NASCAR arose in the Carolinas. The origins go back to moonshiners trying to run away from the revenue man. It was raced on dirt tracks. It was very informal. It was chaotic. And a lot of these small regional tracks, mostly in the Carolinas, some in the Virginias, obviously didn't have the same kind of commercial appeal. They couldn't seat as many people. They were in remote locations, towns like Rockingham and North Wilkesboro and Darlington, small cities, small towns, largely industrial, textile towns. And by, 2000, the mid 2000s, these were just not as exciting of venues. They weren't as popular, certainly not for NASCAR executives, and wouldn't help grow the sport. And so they began to shut down a lot of these races, and they were building up tracks in places like Chicago and Las Vegas and Los Angeles and Miami, and moving the races that had formerly been in these smaller tracks and moving them elsewhere. That decimated these towns. And so at the same time that Kannapolis, Dale Earnhardt's hometown, the textile base there used to have the second largest textile base in the country. The facilities were larger than the Pentagon. That shutters, the textile base in Darlington shutters. You see both the economic and cultural base of these places collapse. And there was this amazing quote that I found from the Chamber of Commerce of Darlington, South Carolina, lamenting the loss of their Labor Day weekend race, saying, this is kind of like what they did to us with NAFTA, that they are ripping out the base, the economic base of our town from us. We are becoming dispossessed, largely because of business pursuit of profit. I sort of was living in the region at that time. I was a kid, so I wasn't able to put kind of two and two together until I looked back. But it is amazing the way in which I think these economic trends, which we've read about in books, we know about Deaths of Despair. We've read books like Hillbilly Elegy and Coming Apart. Sometimes we don't connect those to some of the cultural trends that we've seen as well. And I saw it in the sport of NASCAR and the changes that took place at that time. The sport is kind of starting to make a comeback. I'm very encouraged. They're doing dirt races at Bristol, which is exciting. They're bringing the All-Star race back to North Wilkesboro this year. That's really exciting. But aside from those kinds of small changes, I do think that it will kind of shrink in relevance culturally, certainly from its high point in 2000 and 2001. And I hope that will lead NASCAR to tap back into its regional distinctives, the things that make the sport great.